So we left off talking about how muscle can meet its energy needs. And so the last slide was talking about creatine phosphate. This one we introduced, glycolysis or fermentation as a pathway to do that. And again, your blood glucose or muscle glycogen can feed into this. The glucose enters the muscle cell. It can produce a lot of ATP when oxygen's around. If there's not oxygen, it will be converted to pyruvate, which becomes lactic acid, but you still get some ATP, and that's what matters. Again, you get some energy. So I said this works in strenuous activity when you need more energy but cannot deliver enough oxygen. Otherwise, it's very inefficient, and you couldn't maintain this for very long. So we said that creatine phosphate would buy us about 15 seconds worth of activity, and then glycolysis or fermentation would probably buy us about 2 to 3 more minutes, depending on the amount of glycogen we had. All right, so again, in intense exercise, what happens is ATP is used by the muscle faster than it can be produced. So as I said, energy stored in the creatine phosphate will be tapped to make ATP, giving you about 15 more seconds. Once you deplete that creatine phosphate and oxygen is in short supply, you'll be doing more anaerobic, right, glycolysis, and glucose can be broken down and will provide ATP for about 2 more minutes. All right. So again, the advantage here is that you can keep moving even when you're limited in the amount of oxygen you can deliver, and therefore the amount of ATP. So you don't just come to a stop. So the most important thing that the muscle does for energy is aerobic respiration. So if you have oxygen around, this is far more efficient, but is a little slower in producing ATP. All right, and not phenomenally slower. Okay, again, so let's be very clear. So most of the time, if your muscle has to resort to glycolysis or fermentation, it's because, again, you cannot deliver oxygen fast enough. You are going to be doing aerobic respiration, hands down most of your life, right? Because you can take in enough oxygen to meet the demands of the muscle. It's only when muscle is really put under a lot of stress that you see this need, so very intense exercise. I was talking about things like wind sprints, right, or weightlifting. You do this when you weightlift sometimes. You have to generate so much force so quickly that you tap into your stores of ATP and you can't get enough oxygen. All right, with that said, now let's go on. Oxygen comes in through the lungs. It binds to hemoglobin in the blood, right? This is the reason you breathe. Is transported to the cells in the blood, diffuses in, because it'll be in higher concentration in the blood than it is in the cell, all right? In the muscle cells, right, so here's what we're focusing on, there is another transporter. So another molecule picks up this oxygen and actually can store it, which is really good news, right? So we even have this backup method. So again, this is trying to keep us from running out of oxygen because we like to do aerobic respiration. I do mention that, of course, a contracting muscle can block blood supply, right? So, you're right, yeah, it's going to compress against that blood vessel delivering to it. So oxygen on hand is really important. And so myoglobin delivers for us. And so here we see if we can start with blood glucose, we can start with fatty acids, we can start with pyruvic acid. All of these are beginning things, right, beginning molecules that can be used by the mitochondria of your muscle cells in the presence of oxygen to produce a whole lot of ATP. You then also produce, as a byproduct, carbon dioxide and water, but these go back into the blood and are basically delivered to the lungs for exhaling, all right? And heat, that's the byproduct, is used to keep your body warm. All right, so fatigue is basically that loss of ability to contract in spite of the nervous system delivery. And again, this loss is because, going back again, ATP is used faster than produced. All right, decrease in blood flow leads to this, right? Lactic acid, so again, oxygen is not around. So we don't have a lot of ATP being produced by glycolysis. We don't have a lot of reserves in creatine phosphate, right? And again, here's the situation. You're still trying to move, right? So the nervous system is still stimulating this muscle, but you're limited. As you do glycolysis, lactic acid builds up, and there's more of this than can be removed. It actually does diffuse out of muscle into the blood and goes to the liver, all right? So this decreases the pH, and with that we have a compromise in other chemical reactions. We experience imbalances in sodium and potassium due to repeated depolarization. Again, you're demanding a lot from your muscle, and that requires, and I said, you're sending neural stimulation. Channels are open, and you're depolarizing and repolarizing, and you have, this is affecting calcium flow, right? As we have an imbalance in sodium and potassium, that's gonna influence the ability for calcium to be available. You end up damaging the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the sarcolemma in the sustained exercise. So it goes from being a mild stress to a pretty severe stress, if it's, again, an intense sustained exercise. So contractions weaken with the falling ATP and or the falling calcium availability, because both of these are ingredients, if you will, that are required for productive muscle contraction. All right? Oxygen debt is basically that status after you have completed, right, your exercise. You do have to restore the myoglobin stores and convert that lactic acid back to pyruvate, and then use it in cellular respiration or aerobic respiration. So this is the amount of oxygen that you would need to reset this. So this is the reason, like I said, after you get done with some intense exercise, and you heard, right, you're sitting there breathing very heavily, even though you're done, right, you basically have to, right, take in enough oxygen to reset your muscle stores and to restore, right, the buildup of the toxic waste, if you will, that has occurred during this intense exercise. So I said, now that you're finished, you've got to restore the ATP and the creatine phosphate levels that were there. You've got to convert lactic acid to pyruvic acid, and you have to allow the liver to convert that lactic acid to glucose or glycogen. All right, so that's your oxygen debt. All right, now you can play the Kahoot, but I'm going to go on in here, and we'll talk about now that we've given how does muscle work, we'll talk about muscle contractions. All right. So muscle tension is basically the force generated by the contracting muscle. And again, remember, here's a nice one. When you're lifting a weight, but I gave you an example of moving a chair or a table or a pencil, right? Everything has a certain mass and a force of gravity on it. So if I'm going to move it, I have to generate the equal force in the muscle and really just overcome the force in this that's pulling it down to move it up. So muscle tension, again, is that force, right? So the object is called, is a load. So this weight here is a load that the muscle is moving. So these are just terms we use when we talk about kinesiology especially. So types of contractions to describe some of this force and some of the situation. Isotonic, concentric, and eccentric, okay? So an isotonic contraction occurs when the amount of force is pretty constant. So in this situation, again, in an isotonic contraction, you generally move something, all right? So the muscle will shorten, because, right, that's what muscles do. They pull here, the sarcomeres start shortening. And but when we say constant force, is because you're going to maintain that through the movement, all right? You really, after you've generated enough force, say this is a 25-pound weight, and you've generated that force here in the biceps for this flexion, well, then you're not going to keep generating more and more force, right? Because that weight might just fly right over your head, right? And so, again, consider what we're saying here with the movements that you do, okay? Concentric defines, right, when the muscle shortens. So we call it concentric isotonic contraction. Tension increases to a point, then is maintained, all right? So again, in the beginning, we do have to increase. But again, this is considered a type of isotonic because you maintain it while the muscle shortens. You don't continue to build up force. And the angle of the joint decreases, right? So again, that's what you're seeing here in this flexion. Eccentric, shown here, is that tension is diminished, so force is starting to decrease in the muscle as it lengthens, right? Remember, they're extensible, and the angle increases, right, between these body parts, releasing a weight or putting something down. So these are basic movements, all right? Contraction does not require movement. Okay, so we also have isometric contractions. So the two main types we talk about is isotonic and isometric, and then when we talk about isotonic, we mentioned the concentric and the eccentric. So the isometric, there's our equal measure, So this is when the amount of tension and force increases, but the muscle doesn't change the angle of the joint, and the load doesn't move. So here we are in a stable position, right? We're not increasing or decreasing. We're maintaining, all right? So we're maintaining because of the muscle itself, right? So the muscle is undergoing some contraction, but its overall length is not changing, okay? And because its length is not changing, we're not pulling one bone or body part closer to another, right? So I say here again, so the sarcomere shortens and tension increases, but you do not overcome the resistance of the load, right? This, of course, can happen when something is too heavy, or, more likely, this is really when you are just staying stable, like maintaining your posture, or, standing upright. You don't need to generate more tension. You only generate, again, enough tension to perform the action, and in this case, the action does not require, right, maintaining posture, this muscle to shorten. So we call it an isometric. All right, motor units. So here we are. I know we're back to the the molecular and subcellular parts here, but bear with me. So I mentioned this on a previous slide. I said a motor unit is really the number of muscle cells that are contacted by this one axon. And I said, look, it can be as few as 2. We only see one in this example here, but as few as 2 or thousands. So again, every muscle fiber that is contacted by one motor neuron is the unit. And we say this because when this neuron, this motor neuron, sends that action potential down, it's going to affect all of them. And so they're going to work together, right? A unit. And so here I say, when the neuron releases acetylcholine, every fiber it is connected to responds. And responds in what we've already talked about. Sodium gates open, right? Acetylcholine diffuses across, right? Step 1. Step 2, it binds to its receptor. Step 3, the sodium channel is open. Sodium starts to enter. It's positively charged, so the inside starts to depolarize. This triggers a change in the voltage-gated sodium channels along here, and we just kind of send that along until the change in sodium here affects a change in calcium channels here. Okay, so this would happen in every single fiber that this axon made contact with. So I say here again, motor units can be as small as 2 for fine motor control, or as many as thousands for gross motor control. All right. You can, of course, vary your force. You can do it by, recruiting. That's a pretty straightforward one. We just talked about the motor unit. Well, you don't have just one motor unit in a whole muscle, especially think about something like the trapezius or your deltoids or your huge muscles in your leg, right? The rectus femoris, right? So recruitment is this idea, right? When you need more force, in other words, there's more weight or mass to move, then we're going to have to get more motor units stimulated, right? So, these muscles, especially big muscles, have lots of motor units. So I said there's a lot of variation in the number and size of motor units in the different muscles, which allows muscles, again, to vary their contractile force by quite a bit. And again, just consider what you need the muscles of your body to do. I mean, there's a big difference in the force I need to generate to smile versus the force I need to generate to run, right? Generally, we don't recruit all the units in a muscle, since this is very expensive and leads to fatigue, unless, again, you have intense exercise, and intense exercise is the #1 reason you fatigue. All right, how far can you go? So this is just a measure to show what I've already talked about. I said, look, the sarcomere is limited by, there's only so much actin that the myosin can move along. And as soon as you've run out of any more contact you can make, well, your force is going to decline, as I show you here. Right? And again, remember, tension is just another word for force. So there's basically a range, all right, in which you have a nice overlap between actin and myosin, so they can bind, and once they bind, they can start to generate force. And this, again, is percentage of the length. So there's an optimum length that we start with, and a range in which that sarcomere is going to be moving. Likewise, if everybody's shortened, you can't generate more force. If everybody's too long, right, and you can't generate force either. So think about that, and we'll pick this up on the next video.